Sunday Keita was the founder of the Mali Empire, even though he has a history that goes back further than this in his family. His family would continue to expand his empire ever eastward and making sure that they could travel and get more power, a constantly shifting empire back and forth between several nations and other competing rivals. This would matter more when the Mansa Sakura came into power. Mansa Sakura was not a true Keita in the sense that he was a usurper. And for that, he was a Mansa whose number and day was marked. But before this would happen, writers like Ibn Khaldun, who existed at his time, wrote that Mansa Sakura was responsible for the takeover of Mauritania. Mauritania at this time was as powerful as really any other region, and so taking it over was not a small feat. He didn't just take over Mauritania, by the way, he took over all the states that were in between Mauritania and Mali. This would last for a short amount of time because when he went to Hajj and tried to return, he died in Djibouti, what is today Djibouti. But this does not mean that his history is completely gone, because of course Ibn Khaldun wrote about him and other people. He's not exactly loved by everybody because of course he was a usurper and he's also thought to have wasted a lot of money. In the traditional way of life, the Mansa system or the Keita system, just like many other African kingdoms, was a matrilineal passing, meaning usually the daughter of someone would have a child, and then that child would be the heir apparent. Obviously, a woman can't have a child completely on their own. So, obviously, this does not mean that she had a kid on her own. What it means is that the nobility matters more about the female than it matters about the male. Now, like every empire, you cannot rule the entire state of your empire simply by controlling it from your home base. And so they had vassalages going far and wide. The Mauritanian areas have always had their fights with empires trying to take over, one of them being obviously homemade from the son Haja who went and took over. This happened about 300 years before the death of Sakura when Mauritania was fully taken over. But how did they take over? And what did they use? Well, one of the vassalages that they used in this takeover and maintenance was the Wolof Empire, which was a vassalage of the Mali Empire. The Wolof had taken over places like Senegal, Aulio, Mauritania, and others. And now, because it was part of the Mali expansion, it played a great deal in this very diverse region of these blacks who were diverse in that one location. But not only that, there's Takrur. Takrur as well was known historically to have a diverse population in terms of ethnic. So you have the Fula, the Berber, the Soninke, and all these other groups in that region. And they all, at this time, were under Wolof and then under Mali. To paint a picture of what you would have seen at that time, imagine veils, horses, carts, metals of all kinds, tons of gold, and masters and slaves, the world to see all over. Just everywhere you go, it's just a buzzing area with many different locations of either rock structures or mud slash rock structures, or also hut like structures, but mainly mud, brick, and proper brick, with these multiple organized people in the regions with an explosion population. In fact, we know that once the Mali people took over this area of Takrur, Senegal, Iwalita, and all these other places, their production levels rose significantly. And they, as a result, showed that Mali was not a shrinker of a population. Now, just because they were a strong empire doesn't mean everyone was scared of them. Of course, we know that later on they would be sort of eviscerated by the Songhai Empire. There are also other rivals from their time, like the Kanem Bornu, the Oyo Empire, and so many others that had formed at the similar time. And of course, not to mention the fact that the people in West Africa, in the Western Sahara, and places like that, in Morocco, were not exactly the most friendly people when it came to war, but also wanted to take things back, and any slip up would be the end of their holding of those regions. So, though these enemies are dangerous and deadly, you must remember there were still further enemies that were to come later, but people were always wary of, from the Arabs to everywhere. These were the European powers that, for some reason, had been taking some interest and landing on some coasts in West Africa. The second one was obviously the Arabs, who seemed for the most part to be friendly to the people of West Africa, with some give and take. And some people, Arabs that were stationed in North Africa, were obviously doing this trading of slaves thing that they did. And there was even some of taking slaves by force and stuff like that. We find letters even written about this happening at the time, even from the Sudanic regions, where they start to say, like, even though we're black, we are Muslims, so why are you taking some of our slaves, or taking some of our people as slaves? These Sudanic regions, as you can see, Sudan was something large back in the day. It wasn't just the small part that we call Sudan, but even though the name was founded because of that small region, we see it goes all the way down. And the Berbers and everybody who are situated in the area are all mixed within this one population. You cannot fully talk about Mali without talking about its educational practices that were world renowned. In fact, there's a lot of inventions that exist within the Arab world which is attributed to the Sudanic regions and Sudanic people, because of course the people of Mali, some of them would migrate all the way to other Arab nations like in North Africa and in the Middle East and just stay there. And with this, we find words written all over the world about these specific people. Of course, one of them being Mansa Musa, and whoever the one who was right before Mansa Musa was, as written. by different people because the name is different written by the Arabs as written by the Africans, that this person tried to travel across the oceans between Africa and the Americas and might have discovered America. That's one of the greatest stories ever told about this whole thing. But those stories only highlight the greatness. Well, they don't only, but what something they do is they highlight the greatness of what this empire became. And it wasn't just a small talking thing, and it wasn't just they conquered a few people. It wasn't that they existed with other areas as well, because of course everyone had their own place. The Chadic areas that had already been very friendly with other Arabs, they didn't write as great stuff about them as they wrote about the Mali Empire. I mean, you saw even when I brought up Ibn Khaldun, he seemed way more interested in this particular region than he was in the Kanem areas, only mentioning them a few times. The great places, like of course Timbuktu, that would house libraries and stuff like that, are not to be underestimated, not in any way, shape, or form. Jenne was another one of these vassals of the Mali Empire, and it is thought to have been founded by Soninke people from the Soninke regions, and they established this place way before the Islamic period and developed it to the point where it got to by the end where we see not really an end, but where we see great things coming from it. My question really is, how long have these people and these places existed, and at what point did people decide that they are fit to be taught to people around the world? Since most of these things, I'll be honest, especially at the lower levels of history, are not taught at all. At what point did people decide that they were going to teach these? And of course, I agree with some people when they say we should not teach slavery as if it was something that only happened in one region. But why do they teach education like it's something that opened and happened in one region, as if it came from the West and then everybody else was just marred in ignorance? It is also important to make sure we understand all the individual cultural implications that came from the type of buildings that we see. I mean, I tried to show you that other guy from Italy who took up a lot of ideas from the works, the architecture of Africa, and even he stereotyped a bit using some of the lower structures as if those were true African structures and everything else was not. But we can see that the architecture, the highness of African builders was very high indeed. Food and water are some of the most important things if we just remove all of the higher learning, higher math things. And remember, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Battuta, and so many other Arabs talked about how these guys would go to places like Tagaza and other regions, either in Algeria, Morocco, and mine salt in those areas and then bring them back to their own regions. But not only that, they would then house in cages or in fenced up areas fruits of a particular kind in Algeria. And so Algeria was almost a sort of, let's say, their backyard at the time, where they could just go back and forth doing whatever they want as long as they remained in power, and it was like a middle ground between the northern parts of Africa and West Africa. And of course, do not do this thing of like mistaking that West Africa was completely separate from North Africa. These people had relations with each other that are deeper than what other people are reporting. But obviously, it was not like an empire thing. That's something that I want to get out of my brain. This idea that if you belong to a certain empire, everything that happens to everyone in that empire happens within that empire, unless certain people trade and move and stuff like that. But you must remember there is a bigger expanse of different empires being sort of kinder to each other when they meet in different locations. So someone from Mali, someone from Mauritania, someone from Morocco, someone from Kanem, if they go and meet in like Saudi Arabia, they might be closer to each other in terms of support than they would be if they were in their own regions. And that's something that we notice with the Arabs as well. We see how some of these places that were fully at war are all brought together either by religion, culture, race, whatever. If we look at the trade routes marked down for us, we can see that it was part of a big network that connected Egypt. And of course, we remember they were talking about how Egypt, a lot of Egyptian cotton, a lot of Egyptian clothes would end up in these regions, and how a lot of things that came from these regions would end up in Egypt, trade back and forth, bigger than just West Africa. It's not, these people weren't trapped, they weren't stuck. One of the reasons why I'm mentioning this is because I want to mention also the Kingdom of Congo. I want to go back and talk about that in greater detail because obviously I probably know way more about that kingdom than I do these ones. And these ones are actually way more complicated because there's so much transition of power from one person to the other and all this other stuff. Also, linguistically, it's harder for me to follow because I don't really speak any West African languages. Whereas the Congolese languages, I can at least understand part of it. And so I can interpret a lot of what's going on. But again, if we look at, Egypt, the Sahara, all of that, these were trade partners and they were also serving as middlemen. And so things that came from Spain and Portugal would end up in these regions. But remember, we found things like guns and stuff like that. Not guns, but bow and arrow guns and stuff like that. It would have been harder for those things to have been developed outside of these regions than inside. And so when we find greater inventions that might have existed outside of these regions, it's better to first investigate if they were not created internally. And of course, there was a lot of copier culture, meaning every place in the world at this time was so good at mimicking things that were made better that they started making them themselves. Ships were used at wide ranges as well. There's a few things that confuse me about West African kingdoms, to be honest, which is how much they stuck to their tribal roots. I mean, if you think about how tribal or connected to their tribal roots outside of Christianity and Islam and other bigger religions that affected the world, it surprises me, Judaism, it surprises me how much they kept in their original religions. And I'm not talking about Mali itself now, just talking about West Africa in general. The stuff that they kept, I mean, so much has been lost in just, I mean, I know in Africa that in only 100 years, some people have forgotten basic things about their religion. And so for these people to be able to hold on to their history, this deeply tells you the power of oral tradition. It tells you the power of these people's faith in what they believed in. And a lot of people did not convert. Even when I was talking about the Mauritanian areas during the time of the Mali people, there was a lot of people who refused to convert to Islam all the way to the Western Sahara. After I'm finished doing my deep research into the Katers, I think I'm going to do a chronological lineage about who they were. But enjoy this video for now.